Mr. Sapers, how are you?
I'm well. I'm well.
I'm very happy to see you today and to have this chat with you recorded in the context of this interview for the Wicked series, Who Cares? We're going to be talking today about a subject that is really very interesting and important for us defense lawyers. Our viewers are mainly defense lawyers, and the issue of jails and prisons in Ontario is a problem. It's a hot topic. We will be talking about this. But before we get into this topic, I just wanted you to introduce yourself to our viewers.
Well, certainly, and thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. I appreciate that. My name's Howard Sapers. For a dozen years, I was the Correctional Investigator of Canada. So that's a statutory ombuds office for federally sentenced men and women. Um, After leaving that role at the end of 2016, I did a project for the province of Ontario. I did a 2-year independent review of Ontario corrections and ended up giving the minister and the premier over 160 recommendations over 3 reports, and also helped create the new legislation, the Correctional Services Transformation Act of 2018, which actually received royal assent. But an election happened, and the incoming government chose not to proclaim that legislation into force. Um, so I have some familiarity with Ontario, going back to 2017 and 18 and 19 in particular. And of course, my experience with the federal system over more than a decade. And I'm continuing to work in the field as a consultant. I work with coroners on deaths in custody inquests. I work with private counsel, mostly on litigation to do with uh, rights abuses and lack of compliance with law and policy. Um, and also some other interesting things like applying the Nelson Mandela rules, the Mandela rules, to things like transition homes for men leaving provincial jails. So doing a variety of work as a consultant. A lot of focus as well on the intersection between mental health and criminal justice. That's just been an issue that um, everybody's aware of, and we haven't had a lot of traction, just like the over-incarceration, over-representation of Indigenous men and women in custody, and Black men and women in custody. So some of those enduring issues still occupy my time.
All right, and this is obviously very important subjects for defense lawyers because many of our clients are in custody, and we often hear complaints from the clients about the conditions in the jail. So it's funny that we're having this interview now because recently in the news there was a big story that happened. It was about Maplehurst, and there was a video that circulated about an incident that happened there. So maybe let's start with this and address this
Sure.
hot topic. The video was a bit, I mean, not a bit, it was pretty disturbing for people who saw that. I mean, lawyers, we do hear clients describe the situation in the jail, but I think none of us really could imagine what it really looked like. And so that video really gave us an image of what's really happening. So let's talk a bit about this, Mr. Sapers, like that video.
Sure. Sure, it is a very disturbing video to watch, and for people who aren't familiar with corrections, it's perhaps even more disturbing because I
Mhm.
don't think most Canadians imagine that things like this go on in our jails and penitentiaries, and they do happen. But let's put it in context. So Maplehurst is a very large and aging provincial jail. It's based on what's called a linear design, sort of a design model that probably didn't change from about the 1950s
Mhm.
on. And it's a large jail. Right now, it can house up to 1,200 people. In fact, they call it the Maplehurst Correctional Complex.
Mhm.
Uh, it's a big institution. And it was really originally built to deal with sentenced men, and I think it had a women's unit when it was originally opened as well. Like, I'm not sure if that's the case, but I think it had a small women's unit as well. Um, in any case, most of the people at Maplehurst today are people that are serving pretrial custody or pre-sentence custody. So many of the people, probably 7 out of 10, who go to sleep in that jail and jails throughout Ontario every night, haven't been found guilty of anything yet. And that's important to keep in mind because it also operates as a maximum security institution for the most part. So people that are legally innocent are being held in the most restrictive forms of custody. There's also a significant use of segregation and lots of lockdowns. And for
Mm.
people that don't know what those two things mean, segregation is a status of custody, and it's very depriving, extreme limits on movement within the institution and association with others. And lockdowns are just what they sound like. They're done for usually administrative reasons, sometimes to do with security, often to do with staff shortages.
Yeah.
They lock down either parts or the entire institution. Nobody moves. There's no association. And these lockdowns can last for hours, they can last for weeks. We've had the experience of both in Ontario. So that's Maplehurst. It's that kind of a context. It's a very busy, full, maybe even over full institution. Ontario Corrections has had staffing problems, so it's not always completely staffed according to its staffing model. Um, Often there's a lot of overtime, and people are already working 12-hour shifts in many cases. So, it's not the best set of circumstances. One day, an incident happened in one of the common areas outside the cells, and a prisoner was on the telephone. A correctional officer approached that prisoner. At one point, I believe, put his arm or his hand on the prisoner's arm to move him away from the phone. The prisoner hung up the phone and then, without a warning, turned around and punched that correctional officer. Absolutely inappropriate, needed a response. That was an assault on that correctional officer. And that's a criminal matter. It's also a serious disciplinary issue within inside the institution. That prisoner was quickly controlled and eventually moved off that unit and was charged. Um, and that in and of itself, sadly, is, while it's not frequent that you see that kind of an assault, it does happen. And up to that point, the response looked to be proportionate and appropriate. But a couple of days later, a phalanx of correctional officers dressed in what looks like riot gear. It's called the Institutional Response Team, or ISIT,
Mhm.
or think of an emergency response team. So dressed a very aggressive clothing. They had guns that fire pepper spray balls, pepper balls. Now, there's no other kinds of ballistic weapons inside those institutions, so they don't have carbines or handguns. But these are laser guided, and they look like they look like
Yeah.
semi rifles. So this a number, I can't remember how many it was. It looked like it could have been 24 correctional officers file in quick march, and they basically take over that unit, that area of the institution, and they march prisoners out of their cells with zip ties on their wrists and stripped down to their underwear. All of those prisoners were strip searched. They were held in just their underwear and in zip ties, either kneeling or sitting on the floor. They were under direct watch with these laser-guided guns pointed at the backs of their heads in many cases. It was extremely violent and completely disproportionate and illegal. Um, all of that happened as collective punishment, um, which is not permitted.
Well,
If there
and
if there was a threat risk assessment that showed that there was going to be an incident, that there was a suspicion of, let's say, a ballistic weapon on that unit, or that there was going to be a riot, or that there were lots of edged weapons and
mhm.
people should be preparing for something, and they had good intelligence information about that, and there was a risk assessment done, then you can perhaps see that kind of a unit-wide search and that kind of movement. But even then, the actions were beyond what would have been
Well,
permitted in that case.
and the question here is, was there any kind of information or evidence that that inmate who assaulted the officer, um, that he was associated with others, or that he had plans to do anything further than what happened on that date, or that like he,
Understandably, Ontario Corrections is not letting out a lot of information around their own internal investigation. But what we know, at least what's been made public, is the answer to that question would be no. And from what I know about how these things really unfold in the institution, um, if there had been some evidence that that initial assault was the first of other things to come, and there was information to back that up, I'm pretty sure we would have been told that. Right? Because this is having all kinds of repercussions, and I'm sure that Ontario Corrections would want that side of the story to be told if it was there to be told, and we've heard nothing.
right. And I mean, the proper course would be, for example, an investigation, right? Like, shouldn't there be an investigation first to find out and get more information as to whether something further was going to
Yeah,
happen
well, there
as
should,
opposed.
yeah, yeah, there should be a few investigations. I mean, Ontario has the Correctional Services Office of Investigations, CSOI, who has the authority to
Mhm.
do investigation into that kind of circumstance. The deputy minister could also call for an external investigation, and of course, ultimately the matter could be referred to the OPP and to do a criminal investigation.
Right.
So yes, there should be investigations, and there should be more than one. There should certainly be an internal investigation. There's nothing wrong with that. But I don't think the public would want to rely on just an internal investigation.
Right.
This is such an egregious incident that you would want some independence and neutrality in an investigation, and you can only do that if it's independent of the correctional service itself.
And I know we don't have a lot of information about this incident and as to the reasons behind that, but it seems like it was more like a message that was being given to the other inmates. It was more like to deter them from trying to do this again.
There's always a contest in a jail or a prison. And it's a contest that in some ways I understand, and in other ways I really don't. And that contest is between who's really running the joint. You know,
Hmm.
is it the staff or is it the prisoners? Of course, it's the staff. But it actually keeping a jail safe is a two-way street. And the safest jails are the jails where there is respect demonstrated in both directions, where people don't act arbitrarily, where staff don't use their superior position, their power, their strength in an abusive way, where grievances are dealt with in a legitimate way. All of those things make an institution safe, which means it's a back and forth between the keepers and the kept, right? The
Hmm.
guards and the prisoners. When you see an incident like this, even if the motivation is we have to teach them a lesson or we have to show them who's the boss, what happens is you destroy any trust. You
Right.
destroy the ability for that two-way street, for that conversation, for that dialogue, which has really been demonstrated over time and over many jurisdictions to be the safest way to run a jail. You destroy that. And once you destroy that, it's less safe for everybody. And so I understand the instinct. The correctional officer was assaulted. Nobody wants to see that. But the way to deal with that is not to become more brutal, right? The way to deal with that is not to what's the expression? Bring a gun to a knife fight. You don't need to respond that way. And in fact, it's counterproductive. And the one thing that we know is inevitably the jail wins, right? The correctional officers win. Like it's a closed space. It's a secure space. We haven't seen riots like, Attica or what happened at Kingston Penitentiary in the 70s here in Canada. We haven't seen riots like that. We've had disturbances, but jails and prisons are pretty securely run. And so ultimately, time is the best weapon corrections can use to deal with that kind of problem. They will because they will always triumph. The system will always win in that case. The prisoners will not win if it becomes a battle. So there's no reason pragmatically, and there's no reason in terms of what we know in terms of good practice to do what they did in Maplehurst.
But I mean, at this point, are they going to be held accountable for what
Who
they did?
knows? Who knows? Apparently, there's been some disciplinary investigations. We don't know what the outcome of those investigations are. I guess this will all eventually come out in the wash, and unfortunately, it shakes people's confidence in the justice system because now some of the prisoners who went through that experience are making applications to have sentences reduced, to have more credit attached for the time they spent in pretrial custody because of the conditions that they endured. And so people who perhaps would be legitimately concerned that the full measure of justice is not happening will not be happy with this either. So no matter how you look at it, this is this will create more problems than it would have ever solved. Um, and so it's just a very wrong-minded, dangerous thing to do.
Well, and the fact that we don't have a lot of information, there isn't, and this incident's probably not the only incident. There may have been other similar incidents, but we're not aware of them because they were not brought to the public um, awareness. So that's also what is concerning is that I mean, we hear a lot of complaints from clients, but we don't really know what's going on because we are not there. So,
Yeah. And there are sources of information. So just as an example, when I was correctional investigator of Canada, the office in part of its mandate reviews use of force videotapes.
mhm.
And so we had a small unit that's what they did every day. They watched use of force videos to look to see if there were problems with compliance with policy, was force applied correctly, properly, proportionally, etc. I've watched I can't count how many use of force videos. I've watched countless videos of emergency responses, sometimes to medical emergencies, sometimes to other kinds of security emergencies. And you can get a sense of when things are beginning to go wrong. And there's great policy in most correctional systems, whether it's the Correctional Service of Canada or Ontario Corrections. There's great sets of policies which really lay out very clearly how to behave, how to plan these things, how to execute them, how to document them, how to report on them, how to evaluate them. Um, and when things go bad, of course, it's policy failure. People are just not compliant. And so these things do happen. Now, maybe not with to that extent, but certainly over my career, I've seen other examples of collective punishment. I've seen other examples of inappropriate use of force, inappropriate search. I've seen other examples of behavior which is to basically aim to incite leaving people naked and turning off the heat,
Mhm.
leaving them sit in wet cells because the toilet got backed up, not permitting people to toilet if their cell isn't a cell that has its own sink and toilet. Um, and these are purposeful. These are just things that are designed to incite and provoke torment. And I've seen examples of all of that in institutions. So um, it's you know, the good news is, the reason why I remember them so vividly is because they're not the norm. They're still abnormal. They're still the exception, but they happen often enough that we know it's chronic.
Well, and there are some other issues, maybe not um, at that level. They're not that the intensity is not as strong, but there are some other issues, like, for example, when there are lockdowns or there are three inmates in a cell, there isn't enough space. So those are also problematic. And so the issue here is that why does it seem like when individuals are in detention, it's almost like they lose their humanity. We don't treat them like human beings. It's like, fine, we can put three in a cell, and it's just the treatment becomes like is really horrible. And as you mentioned at the beginning of this interview, especially in the case of Maplehurst, many of these individuals who are in custody are waiting for their trial. So it's not like they're serving a sentence. So they're still presumed to be innocent, and yet they're receiving that treatment. So why is that happening in the jails?
Well, I wish I knew. I mean, you just asked me a question that defines my career. And, so imagine my disappointment. I still don't know the answer.
Mhm.
Jails are not easy places to work in. They're not easy places to live in. As I said before, what makes a jail safe for correctional staff is also exactly the same things that makes a jail stay safe for prisoners. That's just a fundamental fact, and it has to be respected. So there's lots of reasons why these things happen. The infrastructure is problematic. Being short-staffed is a problem. Being poorly trained and supervised is a problem. Um, Being overcrowded is a problem. The proportion of the prisoner population now that is suffering from mental health issues, diagnosed and undiagnosed, comorbidity, often with substance abuse issues. Um, Overwhelmingly, the prisoner population is a population that deals with trauma flowing often from very early childhood, diagnosed with PTSD, etc. Um, we know that there are other cognitive behavioral issues, neurodevelopmental issues, people living with FASD, for example, who have
Mhm.
trouble following orders, following instructions in a sequence. They often run afoul of institutional rules, and so that becomes an under kind of contest. Um, so it's fraught. It's a kind of environment that's where people usually are very hyper vigilant. Even though something bad doesn't happen every day, it could happen every day. So people are always hyper vigilant. That goes for staff and prisoners. Everybody's always looking over their shoulder. Um, if you're in a very crowded institution, you don't even get respite when you get locked in your room to go to sleep, because as you say, you're often now sharing that space that was
Mhm.
designed for one person with at least one other, sometimes two others. I've seen four in a cell designed for one. Um, so you can't even relax. You can't even sort of take a breath then. We sadly we see lots of assaults between prisoners in those shared cells. The space is just too small. The tensions are just too high.
Well, and there are, I mean, they're sharing cells with strangers, people that they don't know. There are sometimes some age differences. It could be a 20-year-old with a 50-year-old, and one of them has a like a mental health issue or something, or and I mean, it could cause some tension within the cell. But so there are several issues that you mentioned here. Overcrowding. So overcrowding, I think this is something that is I would say it's more the legal system that is a bit responsible for that, crowns and judges who over incarcerate or who don't want to release. There's no consent release, so they end up being detained on bail. So that's more a legal system problem, courts problems. But then there's the staff shortage, because this is something that
Mhm.
is some of the times one of the reasons why we have so many lockdowns is because there aren't enough people in the jails to staff those jails. But why is that an issue? Why is it because people don't want to work in jails, or
Well, yeah, that's a very good question. And you know, Believe it or not, when I ask the people that are operating the system, so not even the people that are running Maplehurst Jail or Toronto
Yeah.
South Detention Center or the Ontario Correctional Institution or whatever, not the people that right there in those institutions, but the people at headquarters, in downtown Toronto who do all the planning and they do all the strategic thinking and they do all the policy development. And I ask them that question. People will often say, well, it goes back to the huge staff cuts that were made during the Harris administration. And that eventually created thousands of vacancies in the number of correctional officers specifically that would be available to work. And the idea is that we should even build institutions that are less staff intensive. And we have a couple of institutions that were built in that era that were designed to operate with fewer staff. Which again, if you go back to what makes an institution safe, it is that interaction that requires staff to be available, to interact with.
Yes.
And it keeps them safe as well because they gather intelligence. They're walking the floor and they're talking to the prisoners. It's not just to spend time. It's actually it's good business intelligence. So when you think about it, that structural budget cuts a couple of decades ago are still causing problems today that they've never caught up. And so when I was doing my review of Ontario corrections in 2017 and 18, I was told again there were still a couple of thousand positions short, and they were having trouble not just recruiting but also retaining. Just
Yes.
think about it. You go and you get trained, you get deployed, and the first thing you notice is that you're in a situation that's stressed, that it's still short-staffed, and you've been deployed. People are really happy to see you on the job, but there's still not enough to go around. You're not being properly mentored and supported as you learn the ropes, as you learn how to do that work. People don't stick around. There's other options. And so it sort of becomes a very negative spiral of recruitment, leaving, retention issues, recruitment, training issues. And there's been lots of conversation in Ontario corrections over a long time now about how to deal with that, and they just don't seem to have found exactly the right recipe.
And another issue that also came up recently, I think there was an article in the Toronto Star about that, is the problem of drug abuse and substance abuse in the jails, that unfortunately there are inmates who still continue to abuse drugs, and there have been some overdoses inside the jails, which could be surprising for people who are not familiar with the criminal justice system to hear that inmates inside the jail are having access to these drugs and are still consuming. And so it's actually problematic for drug addicts. And many drug addicts, unfortunately, end up being in custody. So that's another problem that we're also seeing right now in
The
the
leading
jails.
cause of non-natural deaths
Hmm.
are drug toxicity, drug poisoning
Yeah,
deaths. So
in the jails.
yeah, in
Yeah.
the jails. So it's a very big problem. And again, if you just think about for a minute, let's compare a place like Maplehurst to a place like Millhaven Penitentiary, which
Hmm.
is a federal institution in the Kingston Valley, much smaller, about half the size, and it's a maximum security prison, so lots of security, and it holds people sentenced to more than 2 years. So there's no pretrial custody, and nobody's serving a short sentence. Now, even in an institution like that, you do get some contraband drugs in that prison, and they come in different ways. Um, but it's nowhere near the problem that a place like Maplehurst has. If you think about the fact that even though the Ontario correction system on any given day might only have 8,000 people in custody, the federal system on any given day might have twice as many.
Hmm.
The turnover in a place like Maplehurst is far more rapid. People are coming and going every day, all the time, out to court, back, out to the
Yeah.
hospital, back. New intakes coming in all the time. And that porosity to the community is a pathway for contraband, for weapons, for drugs, for cell phones. Um, and it comes in lots of ways. It gets smuggled in, it gets brought in by visitors, by
Yeah.
contractors, people who are otherwise legitimately in the prison. It even gets brought in by staff. But it gets, but when it's brought in by newly admitted people into the institution, um, that becomes a particular problem because often those people have been pressured. They have debts from the street that they need to pay off. So they become a mule or they get their visitors to be mules to try to bring things in. And that just creates all kinds of pressures in the institution. So there's lots of ways. It's a myth, I think, to think that you can create a drug-free prison because the other drugs that are present in a prison, of course, are those that are there because almost everybody is on one or more prescriptions in a prison.
Yeah.
And so there's lots of diversion as well
Yeah.
of otherwise properly prescribed and available drugs. So you're never going to have that down to zero, never.
Hmm.
So you have to do more than just try to enforce it. You can't just stop the supply because there's so many channels where this contraband can come in. So yes, you should put up as many barriers as you can. You should try to stop the supply, but you have to also recognize you're probably not going to be 100% successful. So you have to do lots of other things, and that ranges from uh, programs to deal with addiction
Hmm.
through to harm reduction approaches.
But how
So
effective can a drug treatment program in the jail be? Like, I mean, it just, to me, it sounds a little bit contradictory to have drug treatment in the jail. Like, how is that going to help?
it's not ideal. What we know about most of the cognitive behavioral programming that goes
Hmm.
on in jails and in penitentiaries is that that programming is more effective in the community than it is
Yes.
in.
Yeah.
So, but that said, often when people are in jail, for many, it is a little bit of a wake-up call,
Hmm.
and I've talked to lots of men over my career, in particular some women, but mostly a lot of men who will say, I really, I really want to be sober. Um, not all, but many I've had that conversation with. And of course, it's very difficult because the pressures and the stresses and the challenges of just surviving inside a prison, the
Yeah.
fears they have around their own future. And if they're already dealing with an addiction and they've got all those other pressures, it's very difficult. And so there is something to say about when somebody is ready to embrace or at least to try to make a change is the time where you need to offer an intervention.
Hmm.
And there's a cliche in corrections, which is that every contact is an opportunity for intervention. So it doesn't matter whether you're a correctional officer or a social worker or a program officer, every contact you have with somebody in custody is an opportunity for an intervention. And that approach seems to work in some jurisdictions. We don't seem to do that very consistently in Canada.
Well, so we talked then about several of the problems that we see in the jails, but are there any solutions? Like, what, is there any hope that things can get better? I mean, like we saw that video, it was pretty depressing, and we know that there are still some ongoing issues. And that, of course, is on top of many other issues that we didn't talk about, like the difficulty sometimes for inmates to communicate with their families or to communicate sometimes with lawyers because of lockdowns or short staff. So what can be done to improve the situation?
Well, there's a number of things, and we've talked a little bit around them. First of all, jails on such a large scale as the Toronto South Detention Centre or Maplehurst Correctional Complex don't work very well.
Hmm.
And we look south of the border and we look
Yeah.
at these jails that have thousands of people. I've been in international jails and in places in the Middle East and in Asia where thousands of people are in jails and they're just holding pens. It's
Hmm.
very hard to do anything in that kind of an environment. So we know good correctional practice means having infrastructure that's built to task, that's suitable. That's usually smaller scale. It usually allows for single cell occupancy. It has lots of program space. Interestingly, it has lots of amenities for staff. And amenities, I don't mean like a luxury resort. I mean like
Hmm.
just a place that you can hang up your coat.
Yeah.
I'm like, literally a place that you can quietly eat your lunch, a place where you can access a computer on your break, a place where you can uh, go for your workout at the job site. So wider hallways, more natural light. It's good for everybody.
Yeah.
So design is important, scale is important, hiring appropriately, and hiring not just the right people, but in the right number, and then training them to a standard, and then holding everybody accountable for delivering that standard. So that's the managers, the frontline staff, the supervisory staff, making sure everybody's accountable, and that requires some good oversight, and it requires lots of transparency. And you talked about the system. You know, what are the police doing? What are the prosecutors doing? What are the judges doing? That all plays a role.
Hmm.
Incarceration is meant to be a last resort. It's meant to be the alternative to everything else, not the other way around.
Yeah.
We've allowed everything else to be the alternative to custody. There's
Hmm.
almost this presumption that people will go to jail either before or after or both when they're in conflict with the law. That's frankly ass backwards. That's not the way it was designed. And if you
Yeah.
read the law, you can see that. I mean, the fit sentence, a proportionate sentence, it doesn't start off with the presumption that somebody is going to be removed from the community and locked up. That's not where it starts. So we really should go back to those principles about least restrictive measures, proportionality, restraint. Those legal principles, which is what our system are based on,
Yeah.
are good principles. And if they were honored, we wouldn't be having exactly the same conversation today.
That is um, that is definitely true, and it is part of the problem. And on the other hand, I think that what has been suggested is to build more jails. I mean, I don't know if this is necessarily a better solution because it will just invite more incarceration and more detention. So, I mean, the best solution I think would be to reduce and limit the number of people who are detained, but I mean, I don't know if this is going to be happening anytime soon. Um, One last thing, and I am mindful of your time, Mr. Sapers, but one last thing that I do want to end on is on top of all these issues that we have, it seems like the general public or the public opinion in general is not very much interested in this issue of jails, but it is an important issue. So, how do we get members of the public to realize that this is an important issue that necessitates some
Yeah,
interest?
this one's a head scratcher, right? So if you look, like we're in the middle of an election, and we just had a provincial election. We're now in the middle of a
Yeah,
federal election. So this should be really an opportunity when lots of people are thinking about all their top of mind issues and all the things they want
yeah,
their governments to do and to change. And while there are some politicians who are talking about how we have to, stop the crime, they're not really talking much else. And certainly when you look at the public opinion polls, crime doesn't even make it into the top 10
yeah.
issues that are on people's minds, right? It's affordability issues. What's going on with the United States, the price of housing, access to health,
Tariffs, yeah,
right? Those are the top of mind issues, and they are always the top of mind issues, well,
yeah,
except for nonsense with the tariffs.
yeah,
Um, so crime, everybody has an opinion about crime, and crime is always used as a political football, with always pointing at the other person and saying, well, you're soft on crime. And so nobody wants to be soft on crime. So then you get these sort of knee-jerk reactions. We're going to make laws tougher. We're going to have mandatory minimum penalties. We're going to build more jails. We're going to lock them up and throw away the key. Well, the problem with that is we could never afford it. It's
yeah,
very expensive. Correctional Service of Canada budget's over $2.5 billion a year. Jails are expensive. Um, so we couldn't afford it. You will never build your way out of crime. The responses to crime need to be varied, just like the causes of criminality are varied, and every crime is a very individualistic event. So a one size fits all approach just won't work.
Yeah.
Um, so why? So the public wants to be safe. The problem is that politicians have figured out that if they can make people afraid, then they'll take simplistic answers to deal with that fear so they can be made to feel safe, but it doesn't work. So we need a little bit more integrity, I think, in how political leaders talk about criminal justice and need to remind Canadians that we still, in spite of everything we've talked about in the last, 35 minutes, we still live in a relatively safe society. Canada is seen as a safe haven to compared to many places around the world. We're a relatively safe society. Bad things happen. We need to respond to them reasonably. We also need to recognize what works in terms of preventing the next episode of that bad thing. Um, in criminal justice right now, it seems like if we put somebody in jail and release them, and then they do a second terrible thing, they come back and we give them more jail, and then we release them and they do a third bad
Yeah.
thing, and then we give them even more jail.
Yeah.
Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result may
Yeah.
not be to go here. And often it's because you're not dealing with really what the issues are. If somebody is struggling with an addiction and with a series of mental health issues that may affect how they manage anger, how they make decisions, how they relate with others in conflicts. If unless you deal with those things, you're not going to prevent those negative things from happening. And you pointed out it's very hard to deal with those things in a um, in a situation that's just not therapeutic, which would just describe most of Ontario's jails. There are a couple that are treatment institutions, but the rest, bigger or smaller, kind of operate like Maplehurst. They're just not really designed to be therapeutic places. And for some, there are some people that'll go in and they'll do their very short sentence and they'll get out and that'll be the end of it. And then you have to scratch your head and wonder why they were ever sent to jail to begin with. So
Yeah.
that's so the public does care, but the public's not being told the whole truth about what works and what doesn't.
And so I think then there should be more awareness of what's going on in the jails and that it's something that should be talked about. It should be a topic that is brought more often into the public awareness so that people can realize that it is an important subject and that it needs a lot of work. Um, but I wanted to thank you, Mr. Sapers, for taking the time to chat with me. This was a very interesting interview for me as a defense lawyer. Like, this is a very important subject, and I find that I always want to know more about what's going on. And it was very interesting to me, and I'm sure all the viewers will really enjoy this interview because you really gave us a lot of information about how things are working inside a jail and what happens. And I hope that there will be some improvement and that we can have another interview soon and maybe things will be better. Like, I know,
I hope so too. I've been waiting 40 years, so I'm not holding
yeah,
my.
hopefully, maybe that video that came out from Maplehurst will trigger something and will push people to make some positive changes. I like to be optimistic, so
Me
hope.
too. Always optimistic, but couldn't do the work. Yeah,
Yes, thank you so much.
my pleasure. Thank you.